The Photo Vault, a journey into vernacular photography, archives, and photo books. Hi, and welcome to the Photo Vault. I'm excited to bring you in this episode to a city I very much love, Bangkok. This busy maze of concrete, nature, street vendors, golden temples, amazing restaurants, indoors and outdoors, and the culture in general is always captivating. Besides having lived here for a while, I also pass through Bangkok a lot on my way to Myanmar, where I work on a long-term project called the Myanmar Photo Archive, and on one of these stopovers, I met up with today's guest, Thweep Rittinaphakorn, also known as AK. AK is a self-taught scholar with focus on textiles and art history, and it's quite interesting to hear how he came to be a photographic collector as well. He recently published a book titled Unseen Burma, Early Photography 1862 to 1962. I had met AK once before in Bangkok, as we do share a passion for Myanmar's history, and I was glad to hear how his collection had developed. A quick summary of the conversation will be at the end of the podcast at about minute 32. Ake, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Lucas, for having me in your show.
No, it's a pleasure to talk to you and sort of try to follow your path of collecting, follow your path and your interest in especially photography from Myanmar. You recently brought out a book. Tell me, how did your interest start in Myanmar in general? I mean, we're sitting here in the heart of Bangkok in your apartment. I can see wonderful pieces from your collections all around. I mean, I can see you're interested in objects, in materiality, in textures. How did that interest start?
Well, I think the thing about Myanmar, we have to say that, I was born here in Thailand, and then Myanmar is just next door neighbor. But growing up, we have such a limited information about Myanmar. We almost know nothing about it apart from political instability and a lot of fighting. And that's something that seems to be like a black box that sits next to you since I was growing up. So I think that's one thing. When I start to get into it, it seems like everything is so, curious. I want to know more and more about this country. And especially when you dig into it, and then Myanmar has a fusion of a very unique culture mix. There's some Indian part, there's some Chinese part, and there's some even Thai influence fusing into it. And of course, the Western influences that came from the colonial period. So I think Myanmar in itself is a very unique, melting pot of different things. I think that's why I feel that the look, the feel, the vibrancy of Myanmar culture is something that is fascinating.
And where was your first contact to that?
I think when I was young, I went with my parents to the border market near Tachilek, up in the northern parts of Thailand. And at that time, I was so young, I didn't know what to do. But I remember vaguely that there was a row of shop house once we crossed the border. Back then, it was still very rural. We crossed the border. There was a row of shop house. And some goods from China. I remember seeing a lot of shop house selling forest products, some plants, some orchids, or even some of the tiger felts, deer antler, different things. And as a kid, I was so fascinated by all these curiosities that I saw. And that's all I knew about Myanmar, from the old days. Yes.
And your own interest as an adult?
I think, I came to the realization recently that why you mentioned about me collecting so many things, I was trying to analyze myself. Maybe I think it's to do with, when you were a child, like when I was a boy, I have moved so many different places, and then so many places that I hardly have the place that I can call my own place up until I grow up. So I think that's maybe has something to do with me and trying to possess so many things to collect something to make a place that would feel like my own place when I grow up. I mean, that psychologically, there must be a link into that, And the thing about collecting, to me, it happens to be photograph, textile, something Burmese, But I think the idea of collecting is something that I think it teaches people to dig deep into something when you are interested. Whether you collect matches boxes, you collect napkins, whatever. But it just lends you the deep passion that you go deep, you study, and you learn more about it. And I think that's a good behavior that everyone should cultivate. I think yes.
So in a way, collecting, which could be also just intellectual collecting, it doesn't have to be objects, is a study of whatever you're passionate about.
Yes, it's a deep passion into something, because when you have deep passion into something, it there's a purpose of you, when you do that. And it would be wonderful if you can use that thing to benefit others, like what you're doing, and what I'm doing, and what so many other people are doing, using their passion, their deep interest to create something nice.
I love that analyzes though that the collecting for you is in a way a form of grounding. Like you make your own space, you create your own person, you create your own self by the collection also.
I think so, but I'm not a psychologist, so maybe you have to. Psychologists might have other ways of explaining it.
Mm-hmm. But just for you, I mean, that makes a lot of sense, I feel.
Yes.
And you started to be very interested in textiles from Myanmar, is that right?
Yes. I think as a child, I like something old. I like something that feels nostalgic. And throughout the college, we took classes on anthropology, sociology, art appreciation, all those foundation courses. I think it bit by bit, it shaped us and our way of thinking. So when I look at things, I don't look at it from just what it is, but I look beyond that, What's the meaning? What's the purpose? Who used it before? Why there's a flower motif on it? Why it has to be this shape, not that shape? I think that has somehow, propagate in the way I look at things. And that's when the collecting become fun, I would say, And then I got into textile because, textile is something very personal, and because you learn so much about the person who owns it before. Because it talks about like the how much money you had, or even the style, the color that you prefer, or even like your appearance, you're short, you're tall. It's I think it's fashion is fun, and then even I'm not so expert when it comes into weaving technicality, but I can get by. But to study all this together, it talks so much just beyond the objects itself, but everything that surrounds the object, And for me, I think that's what my interest is when it comes to collecting something.
And how do you go about finding interesting textiles in Myanmar?
Well, we have to say that, Thailand and Myanmar is so close to one another. And before there was a political border that has been clearly drawn, there's some exchange of goods, commodity across the borders already. Or even during the 60s onwards, when Myanmar was already into isolation, the only way that Myanmar can have access outside is through the border trade with Thailand. And through that, a lot of things has been brought over, including some old fabric, old textiles, the vintage ones. Something that I think in Myanmar, during the height of their hard time, the idea of preserving materiality hasn't been set in place yet. They look at the material culture possibly from something more of the hardcore thing, like pagoda, important Buddha images, those kind of thing. But vernacular material, nobody was interested. Lacquerware, clothing, So a lot of this vintage one, old one, has been brought out through the border town. So you find a lot of this material circling around in Thailand, I think since then. And that's why I got my first contact into Burmese textile because of this.
And it's very distinctly different from, let's say, what happened in Thailand in the textiles. And I'm a novice. I have no idea, So
I think in so many Asian countries, it's the same kind of pattern that is happening. Like in Thailand, back in 1950s or 40s pre-war. At that time, I think Thailand has changed from absolute monarchy to constitutional monarchy. There's a lot of tensions going on. The aristocracy class was going down because of the government change and everything. And then the Second World War, and they came an influx of the Western tourists traveling the world again. And at that time, I think in Thailand, people were not really paying attention much about collecting art object or artifacts. A lot of things were not even antique yet. They were just 50, 60 years old. So many Westerners that came, I think it's the idea of the Western eye seeing the Asian object as something exotic. It's the same thing like how chinoiserie became a big hit in Europe, or even how the Dutch tried to replicate the blue and white from the Chinese. So all the Westerners that came, they saw this first and they start collecting. That's why a lot of material were brought back to Europe. And I think it's the same thing. A lot of countries have to pass through that kind of evolution. And especially I think in Asia, the idea of collecting art object is not something common to our thinking. Like in Myanmar, you've been to Myanmar, Myanmar a lot. You will see that a lot of things were just donated to pagoda for merit making. People might have very few beautiful things at home to show. The idea of having a nice living room with art object to show people, these are Western ideas. They're not really the local idea here, unless you are the ruling class.
So you are a rarity.
Oh, that's such a noble word. I am not sure if that's would be a good fit for me. But I'm lucky to know what I like, and be able to learn and get to know it more and share with people. I think that's the blessing that I have from collecting.
And how did you then go from textiles to photography? It's such a interesting jump.
Well, when you collect something, I'm sure you would have the same kind of thing. You collect something you want to understand, and by trying to understand, you will find something that is connected to it in the peripheral area of how the object is used. So for me to study textiles, the first thing to do is to try to understand how it is worn, when it was used, how it is put together, how the dress is put together. And that's why I started to turn into the visual evidence of how the textile were used. There could be some lithograph printing, there could be some painting, but I think in Myanmar, I'm lucky to come across photographs, maybe from those famous photographer Felice Viato or Philip Clears, the iconic shots with the Burmese lady wearing long G. So that was my entry point into photographs, because I want to find a reference to the textiles that I collect. And then from that, I'm fascinated by what is there in the photographs. And from from people portrait, then it expands into different things about old photographs.
And that was for you easy to find these kind of imagery?
I think for late 19th centuries or early 20th centuries, photos taken by famous photographers, you can still find them in Europe or in England, even in the States, because that's where they were brought back with the foreign clients.
To add here, a reason why a lot of the late 19th and early 20th century photographs are to be found outside of Myanmar is that the photographers at the time were colonial photographers from the UK, Germany, or Italy. And so they would produce primarily, but not only, photographs of foreigners living in Myanmar. Or they produced also tourist souvenirs like postcards and photographic sets that were bought by tourists and then brought outside. Back to AK.
But then more and more, I'm more fascinated with the work of the amateur photographers, like from 1900 onwards, when you have portable camera, you have rolls of films. You start to see how just common people see the world and they take photographs. Sometimes it doesn't have to be a very well composed, nice photograph, but you see according to what their eye sees, and that is fun. Especially when you come across an album, you get to see how a person curate his or her own collection as well. And most of them would have a small caption talking about this and that. I think to me that is more fun to me now. Although visually, when you do a book, of course, you will need a very nice photograph. Or sometimes when you post on social media, you would look for a photograph that it looks attractive in itself. But sometimes all these amateur photographers, you might get some blur picture, very ill-composed picture, but I don't mind. But that was the fun of it.
So now that, so in the beginning, your photo collection was a reference to textile, but
Yes.
that has evolved.
Yes.
So now you're a real photo collector.
I well, I learned so much from it, and especially sometimes you find a shot of a same spot, but at a different timing, then you can compare what is happening. And what I'm more fascinated is that although back then they don't really do a big print, you find a lot of photograph in a very small print, but that doesn't deter the quality of the clarity of the photograph. Most of the time now I use my iPhone and I took very good photo of that small photograph, and when I zoom in, all the details are so clear. And I think it's fun, and you look at the situations or buildings or how people interact, a lot of market scenes. I look into the details of the product they were putting on the ground to sell, some potteries. Or just last week, I posted one photograph of a lady in Shan State. She was standing in front of the tall lilies that is grown in front of the huts. And suddenly, people came in and replied to me that, my other friend who is an expert on plants, he came and he gave me the scientific name of the lilies. And so I think these are the fun of collecting, visual material.
Yeah, and I think so too. And that's also, it gets more and more interesting the more and more you can share that, actually, because you start to have a conversation and you understand so many things that you yourself are not capable of understanding, of course.
And the other thing is that now with the mean of social media, the positive thing is that you get connect to other people easily, especially when you do your hashtag in a more strategic way using the correct keywords. There are more chance for people with the same interest that can find you. And so far, I've had not only the local Myanmar people, but also the Burmese overseas. A lot of second generation or third generation Burmese overseas that they were born elsewhere, they are finding their own roots as well. And most of the time, they don't have much of reference to refer to, and English is a common language that they are more familiar because they were not born in the country. So they find my social media, giving them information, something about their motherland, that somehow they're missing.
And is it curious for people that you as someone from Thailand is so interested in that?
I think people don't know what to make out of me, I base in Bangkok. I'm Chinese Thai, but I post lots of things about Myanmar. I have people thinking that I'm Chan because somehow I look Chan as well. So, and they were always fascinated when they learn that I'm not Myanmar, or by blood, I'm not Myanmar.
Yeah, me too. I thought in the beginning, yes, even though you have a very Thai name, I thought, you're probably somewhere Burmese.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
And so you published a book recently. Tell me about it.
Well, since I started posting pictures on the social media years ago, it triggered some interest. And then my publisher, we've known each other for some times, and she said, why don't we do a book about old photographs of Myanmar? It would be fun. And especially, there hasn't been the book that deals with very old photograph of Myanmar for a long time. You did a fantastic book on a recent photograph of the vintage photographer, and that's a huge contribution.
Aki refers you to a book I released titled Burmese Photographers that focuses not on colonial imagery, but rather local photographers. The book will come out internationally next year. So far, it was only a Myanmar production.
And so the idea came along, and when I tried to put together a concept of the photo, my own thinking is that from my own experience, people know not so much about Myanmar, and they only know something that has been tainted by only the last few decades of instabilities, and that seems to be the only bad impression people have about Myanmar. So I want to show people how Myanmar used to be. It used to be so big, economy-wise or even resources-wise, and it's part of the big globalization that has happened in our world. And that somehow has been missing from people understanding. So that's why I came together with the concept of why don't we showcase Burma 100 years, starting from 1962, but we backtrack 100 years because 1962 was the pivotal point where everything took place. And since then, it's not the same anymore, but backtrack 100 years to 1862. So during that period of 100 years, Burma had seen so much changes. From there was still King Mindong was still the ruler of Upper Burma. The British already came. Then it progresses to independence. So it's a rich history there, and I think I want my book to showcase that, and especially for, I think it. To me, my publisher and I are in the same kind of thinking that the book should help to remind Myanmar people of their glorious past, no matter how the hardship, the challenges they have to face. They used to be big, and we should not forget that.
I mean, the beauty that it's with River Books, based here in Bangkok. The beauty is that this book is coming out here in Southeast Asia because, of course, we have some historic books on Myanmar by European publishers, but I think they're very hard to find here.
No, I have to say that in Thailand, it's not really a big market for such a kind of niche subject, And for me, the idea of doing this book, I also follow something that I feel it's an unmet need for me as a consumer to other books, because a lot of book has old photograph, but often they study about the photographer, they study about the techniques, but most of the time it doesn't tell much about what is in there in the photograph. So that's why when I do this book, I made it a point that I need to write a long caption for every photograph. I need to explain what is going on, what I see in the photograph, the plants, the costume, the people, whatever device I see in their activities that they do, or even some macro context about what is going on in the photograph. It's just for people to enjoy what they're seeing.
So your collecting turned you into a storyteller.
I think yes, I think so. That's a good point that you're putting, because if you collect but you don't tell the stories or do anything about it, you're just a hoarder.
No, I mean, as you know, I mean, me working so much, not only in Myanmar, but other countries that have so much history, but also conflict. Once you have a collection from a place like that, you also, in my opinion, have a certain responsibility to transmit that you have.
Yes, I think so.
And that's beautiful. I haven't studied your book yet, so I'm really curious to read and gain more knowledge also in a country that I'm so invested in. Because the beauty is that you have this very specific eye, like looking at fabrics, looking at materiality.
Yes, but I'm very bad from the photographic technicality standpoint. If you ask me to explain what is daguerreotype, how is it different from colloidal red plate, I might not be able to give you a correct answer for that. That's what I'm very bad.
But that also that engages with a very different audience, and that's the beauty.
Yes.
The emphasis we make is the people we can find as readers and listeners and viewers. I think that's really important that there's a different narrative on that.
And I think we both share the same area of work because we deal with some photographs from post Second World War as well, or even pre World War II. And I think I'm sure you must have come across the same comment that a lot of young people, when they see, they can make the reference right away. Oh, this just looked like my grandmother, my grandfather. This is something I had that hung in the wall of my old house. And I think it sparks off the interest of their own heritage.
Yeah, creating value.
Yes. They might go back home and see whatever was hung on that wall differently. Never be the same again.
Yeah, and this is something I also try to communicate to people when I'm back in Europe and the US, is that it's very different when you don't have large access to your past, which in many countries in the world there is, but in many there isn't. Where you're not, it's not clear to you that what your your grandmother did, because you have this one photo of your grandmother, is what every grandmother did, because you don't have a common visual history that you know of.
Yes.
Because it's not accessible.
Yes.
And I think that's a huge difference. Yeah.
Yes. So, our work, hopefully it will benefit the local in this way.
How is that in Thailand in terms of historic processing, archives, collecting? Are there local institutions? Is there?
Well, the biggest government-owned collection would be at the National Archives. There are 1,000, I think 30,000. I think that's my estimate, but around there, of glass negative that has been kept, and every year it's a continuous project that they will try to develop the photograph from those negatives and have the special committee that sits together to try to read the photographs. And I think so far they've been able to publish 3-4 very thick books with a lot of interesting photographs. And at the moment, they are in the process of putting everything online. So the archive is searchable now online, which is very accessible. Or you can personally visit the place and try to ask for things and get the copy of the file for your studies. I think that can be done. But apart from that, you get quite a good amount of local collector who collect photographs. Some of them, they don't collect all photographs from material perspective, but they study all photograph, the content inside. So it's a huge interest of the subject from the olden days through the photographs in Thailand.
Of course, Thailand, from a historic development point of view, is very, very different. Even from a university point of view, because I think that's one of the issues we have in Myanmar, that the universities don't foster that idea of art. You don't have a real art university. You don't,
Yes.
That's definitely a big change. And I guess your late king was an avid photographer.
Oh, yes. Yes. He took a lot of photographs, and I think when you look at the photograph, you can learn so much about the person who took it. His interests, even how the photographs want the model to turn, to pose, and different things. But of course, you need a collection, so you see some consistency, some difference, enough for you to analyze.
When you think about Myanmar and your collection, what is there that you're still looking for?
Well, that's
There's always something, no?
Well, across different category of subjects on the photograph, I still find people in action something that I like most. Like, I would get so excited when I see the photograph of the markets, because I want to see what people were selling, what do they dress, and what do they do. Or even when you see the photograph of the Shinbyu or the ear piercing ceremonies,
Shinbyu, as AK just mentioned, is the Burmese term for a Buddhist ceremony where a boy enters the Buddhist order for the first time. I will add a link in the text section to this subject.
I get to see not only how they dress, but what the ceremonies entail, because it shows in the photograph, or even the slight details like what kind of food, snacks that they serve, because somehow you see that in the photograph as well. I think that's still the top ranking for me in terms of what excites me when it comes to different photographs.
Yeah, we just digitized maybe about 6,000-7,000 negatives from a studio in Taungji, in Shan State, from a photographer who's still alive, who gave me the images. He has actually many more. He might have maybe 100,000.
Glass negatives?
No, from the 80s and 90s. So probably 70s, 80s, 90s.
Right.
But what's fascinating, because I looked through all of them, it's that he's really recorded all the family ceremonies. So whether it was a Hindu wedding or it was, any from any part of society, he had access to them, because Taungji is very mixed culturally. So he had really access to different forms of funerals, different forms of weddings.
Oh, wonderful.
So and really the details, like what snack do you put in your mouth?
Yes.
Like, what's on the table? What was eaten? What was cooked? Was prepared? Like,
yes.
So very, very detailed records. I'm sure you'd be interested in that.
That's wonderful. And I think people who are researcher in any field can be benefited from this.
I have to add here some info. Taungji is the capital of Shan State, and Shan State is sort of in the center north. of Myanmar. It's a fascinating place with many tribes living there, like the Shan, the Palong, the Pao, or the Wa people.
The hard part is to make that accessible so people don't have to look for 5,000 photos, but
I think that's the thing. You need people to read the photograph, provide proper indexing, the keyword, so that when they do the searching, it will be much easier.
Yeah, that's something we're working on, but that's And how do you feel? I mean, you put, I guess, a small part of your collection into this book. Does it make you feel differently about your collection?
I mean, in the future, I want to do more research on the photographs. As I said, when you see the photograph in the whole album, maybe to do more research about the whole album in itself. I think that would be something that I'm keen to do. But most of the time when we find the photograph, they were taken out of the albums. Not so often that we get the full albums. And of course, when you get the full album, full collection, there's so much that you can learn and try to study. As you said about the Tangji photographer. So the whole world that he was working on, the complexity that he has get involved over the years of his career. But that cannot be deciphered if you only get one photograph or two photographs.
No, definitely. That kind of single source material that really can make us think about a specific place in a specific time.
Yes. Or even some album that I have, I'm fortunate to have, is an album of the travelers during the 20s where they board on the steamship. They left England, they went to France, there was some photograph in Egypt, and they come down to Sri Lanka and this. And so you can easily tell the whole trip from one album. And you can even kind of see the itinerary just by the way the photograph is arranged. And who was there, what was it like in the steamship down Irrawaddy River in 1920s? What sort of decor or saloon that they were staying on the ship.
Makes one nostalgic. Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for this conversation.
You're most welcome. And, I'm very happy to see you again. And I wish you all the success as well. I'm your fan as well, Lucas.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome.
That was Thweep Rittinaphakorn, whom I met in Bangkok. I very much liked his approach of how a photographic collection can inform other areas of research and how he came to be interested in all the details in each photograph, even corresponding with botanists that can tell him what flowers are being seen in the images. It was also fascinating to hear someone from Southeast Asia working on research in another Southeast Asian country and listening to his experience of how he is viewed by the Myanmar community. You can find a link to his Instagram and recent book, Unseen Burma, in the text section of the podcast. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Photo Vault. Lucas Birk says, Sawadee Kap.